Nearly 8 years after Stephen Smith was found dead in the middle of a Hampton County, South Carolina road, investigators are officially calling his death a homicide, not a hit and run. I'm Angenette Levy, and thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. The pathologist who performed Stephen Smith's autopsy back in 2015 said that his death was the result of a hit and run, but investigators and even the Hampton County coroner never believed that. Validation came late Tuesday for Stephen's mother when the head of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division called her lawyers and said he and his agents have always believed that Stephen was murdered. I spoke with Sandy Smith's lawyer about the call. Ronnie, tell me a little bit about what happened when Chief Keel called you yesterday.
Yeah, we got an amazing phone call yesterday. When the state's top cop calls you and says that, look, if you guys are planning to exhume that body because you feel like you need to convince us at SLED that there's something more, something different here than a hit and run, you don't need to do that. So that was an amazing phone call. And he communicated to us that SLED is on this investigation, that they do not see it as a simple hit and run, and that they are putting resources towards it, especially now that those resources are freed up after the Murdaugh murder trials.
Ronnie, were you and Eric on this call together? And were you surprised? Because a lot of times law enforcement will tell people, hey, get out of our investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was just a new spirit of cooperation. Now, in the Murdaugh financial crimes, we had cooperated fully with SLED, and we certainly shared with them all the information that we found about his financial crimes and assisted in the investigation in that fashion. So I do think that helped broker some spirit of cooperation between our firm and SLED. So there's some built-in credibility there. But to get a call from the top cop who shares that information was really incredible and very uplifting for the Smith family.
Ronnie, I spoke with a spokesperson for SLED on Tuesday night, and I told her what Eric Bland had said, that they believe there's a small circle of people who have information about Stephen Smith's death. And now some of those people may actually feel more comfortable coming forward now that Alex Murdaugh is in prison and has been convicted of 2 murders. However, there's some reporting out there that says that SLED, according to sources, is not focused on the Murdochs. So do we know if there's any type of connection there? We're kind of looking at this and wondering.
Yeah, that was stated. It was stated that they didn't feel the environment was conducive for people to come forward and speak openly and honestly with the pall of the Murdaugh trials and investigation ongoing. And the sense was that now that kind of that Murdaugh hold on the community is broken, that maybe people would be more forthright and forthcoming. Now, I don't know what that has to do with persons of interest. There was nothing in the communication with Chief Keel to indicate that any Murdaugh was a person of interest or a target. So we didn't gather that at all. What we took away was that the resources were thin and that the community was kind of maybe a little closed-lipped and tightened down because of all the scrutiny surrounding the whole Murdaugh debacle.
Ronnie, the SLED spokesperson told me that they've always believed that Stephen's death was a homicide. That's why they opened the investigation into his death to try to figure out what happened. So is that what Chief Keel relayed to you?
Yeah, he said that we didn't have to convince him that SLED did not see this as a hit and run. And I know I've reviewed some of the material from the investigative file that took place from the original investigation, and I could see some of the tension in that file, a tense exchange between SLED agents and the pathologist who did the original autopsy. Um, it described this tense interaction where they were asking questions and kind of getting answers that you could tell from the notes were not satisfactory, that they didn't accept then that this was just a hit and run. But it feels like the investigation got stuck between agencies. Is it a vehicular matter that's the jurisdiction of the Highway Patrol? Is it a murder that's the jurisdiction of SLED? I think somewhere between that and all the resources being diverted to Murdaugh kind of got this investigation derailed on the front end.
Ronnie's law partner, Eric Bland, talked to me a little bit about what Chief Keel said led the investigators to open a case looking into Stephen's death.
He said was he did confirm that there was a piece of evidence that they discovered during the investigation of Alex Murdaugh murders. And he said that he didn't tell me what it was. And I said to him, well, I can only assume that it was maybe some kind of phone evidence or something on a computer. And he did not refute that, but he didn't confirm it for me. And so he said, I appreciate, you willing to work with us.
And I asked Eric Bland what he believes happened to Stephen Smith, how he believes Stephen was murdered.
I think it was a hate crime. I hate to say it, but I think you had a 19-year-old openly gay young man in the low country of South Carolina, which is not common. It's not like he's in New York City or in Ohio where you're from. And I think there may have been a hate crime, that he was killed because he was an openly gay kid, whether it was because he had a relationship that somebody didn't want exposed, or he had done something to somebody with his lifestyle. I do not know. He was somewhat secretive, as Sandy has said on TV. He did not disclose a lot of his lifestyle. He said he was dating a very important man, is all he disclosed to Sandy, and that he was going to go away with that man the following weekend, Angenette.
How do you believe Stephen died? I mean, he had a dislocated shoulder and head trauma.
There was supposedly blue flake metallic on the back of his head, which easily could have been tested and can be tested still if there's some there, whether it's automobile paint or it's from an aluminum bat. Baseball bats have flaking blue paint. I think it was blunt force trauma. Look, he's lying in the middle of the road. His shoes would have been blown off. They were loosely tied. I've seen the autopsy photos.
Ronnie, what was Sandy's reaction when you called her and told her about what Chief Keel had said?
I mean, imagine you're the mother who's lost a child, and every fiber in you tells you that this was not a hit and run. This was not an accident. So 8 years later, finally, the police call you and say, we believe you. We're throwing resources at this. We're with you. She was elated.
So where do we go from here?
We go forward with the exhumation. I mean, that is a critical next step. I don't know what SLED does in their investigation. We're not SLED. Thank God to the folks at GoFundMe who raised the money to provide the resources. We've contacted experts locally and nationwide who are willing to perform this service for us. So it has to start with the what, right? What happened to Stephen, and what happened to him is going to be determined by that autopsy.
Is there any accountability for what happened back in 2015? Dr. Aaron Presnell, who conducted the autopsy on Stephen Smith, said that he died as a result of a hit and run. This was a pedestrian versus vehicle. She labeled the manner of death as undetermined, not a homicide. And some of the investigators, if you go through the file, said at the time, she kind of blew them off and said, this is not my job to figure out what happened to Stephen. It's yours.
Yeah, so now you're getting into the question of the who's, and we're going to stick with the what's for right now. So what happened to Stephen is the first domino that needs to fall. Who has responsibility, I think is a downstream question. And then the ultimate question that we all want the answer to is why. Why would someone brutally kill this this beautiful young man in the fashion that he was killed? So those are the questions, and that's the order of those questions.
It's important to note that SLED opened its investigation into Stephen Smith's death after discovering some information in the course of the investigation into the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. Now, that does not mean that there's necessarily a connection between Stephen's murder and the Murdaugh family. Earlier this week, Buster Murdaugh issued a statement denying any involvement in the death of his high school classmate, Stephen Smith. Buster had been talked about in online circles and mentioned in documentaries as possibly a suspect since the Murdaugh name came up throughout the course of the investigation. But Buster says he had nothing to do with this. For Law and Crime, I'm Angenette Levy.